Hello, hello, my lovely subscribers. This is the long-awaited video where I divulge all of the books that I have never told you about, that I have read. And the reason why I haven't told you guys about some of these books is because they don't fit neatly into any of the categories that I felt were pertinent to this channel. However, I think that they should be shared regardless. The books that are on here are from authors that have nothing to do with one another, and all of them have entirely different plots and subject matter, and some of them are even disturbing, and that's a part of me that I'd like to share with you guys because I have an affinity for disturbing things and grotesque things. Some of the books I don't have in my possession. I have read many books on Audible. Some of these books I read years ago and I just never told anybody about them or recommended them, and some of them are more recent. But I think the best person to probably start this video off with would be my beloved Clarice Lispector. Now, I could say that any book I could recommend to you, any short story of hers, I think I could recommend to you. I recently read some short stories in the collection called Family Ties, and I have posted some of the excerpts from those stories, but the book specifically, because I have some really great passages that I want to share with you. The book that I wanted to talk to you guys about today that I think is really quite wonderful from Clarice Lispector is Agua Viva. While this was not my introduction to Clarice, my initial obsession with Clarice is that she put into words a feeling that I had been experiencing, a very disturbing feeling regarding existence, and feeling a little bit too close to something forbidden that I had been rubbing up against all the time. And I read The Passion of According to G.H. was my first book by her. But after reading a few after that, I came upon Agua Viva. It was the last thing that I read by her. Agua Viva was like coming face to face with the absurdity of the world, being this wellspring, quite literally, like a fountain of inspiration and connection and dimension. And it was a much happier book, which is kind of why I recommend it. The passages that were in this, I was listening to the audiobook of it while I was walking through a museum in Ohio. There were parts, where a book is so good that you have to like sit down and you like really, I was listening to it obviously, but you sit down or you have to just look out and you're like, holy shit, that's amazing. That's beautiful. And I just want to share some of those passages with you. Agua Viva is a plotless book. There's nothing to really say about it. It's literally just Clarice at her typewriter writing down anything that comes to her mind, even though it was a book that took a very long time and it was edited a lot. It's a stream of consciousness. I just want to share some of these passages with you because I thought they were so wonderful. One of them was, I actually posted this on my Instagram, was talking about surrendering to an instant, and talking about how that instant is represented by a bird. Holding a little bird in the half-closed cup of your hand is terrible, like having the trembling instants inside your hand. The frightened little bird chaotically beats thousands of wings, and suddenly you have in your half-closed hand the thin wings struggling, and suddenly you can't bear it, and quickly open your hand to free the light prisoner. Or you hand it quickly back to its owner so that he can give it the relatively greater freedom of its cage. Birds, I want them in the trees or flying far from my hands. I may one day grow intimate with them and take pleasure in their lightweight presence of an instant. And then before that, she says, nothing is more difficult than surrendering to the instant. That difficulty is human pain. It is ours. Like, that's just wonderful. I don't think I've ever heard more accurately described that terror, that small little terror. And scale-wise, it just makes sense for it to be in your palm and to be so connected and intimate to you, and that it's a bird, and how we feel, around moths and other animals that move very quickly and they're kind of frightened. And that was a very accurate way, I think, and very poetic way of describing the instant and just this of life, just the immediacy of life. And she has so many excerpts like that. She talks about this intimate connection with a rose. Roses seem to be a archetypal image in Clarice's work, and they hold a lot of symbolism, and they even can be animate, it seems. And she talks about a rose in this way, that she develops a relationship with it. She says, "I know the story of a rose. Does it seem strange to you to speak of a rose when I am talking about animals? But it acted in a way that recalls the animal mysteries. Every 2 days I would buy a rose and place it in water in a vase made specially narrow to hold the long stem of a single flower. Every 2 days the rose would wilt and I would exchange it for another, until one certain rose. It was rose-colored without coloring or grafting, just naturally of the most vivid rose color. Its beauty expanded the heart by great breadths. It seemed so proud of the turgence of its wide-open corolla and of its own petals that its haughtiness held it almost erect." So she talks about this rose, that it was just a rose that seemed to be immortal, like it wouldn't die, and it was the longest lasting of all of her roses. And I felt that was very sweet, that she had this kind of connection to a plant, that it wasn't that of a flower, that it wasn't another person even, and that there was something mystical and sacred about that relationship with a dead rose, really. I mean, a cut rose. So I found that really wonderful. And then another one, she talks about mirrors too. She talks about what is a mirror? It's the only invented material that is natural. Whoever looks at a mirror, whoever manages to see it without seeing himself, whoever understands that its depth consists of being empty, whoever walks inside its transparent space without leaving the trace of his own image upon it, that somebody has understood its mystery of thing. For that to happen, one must surprise it when it's alone, when it's hanging in an empty room, without forgetting that the finest needle before it can transform into the simpler image of a needle. So sensitive is the mirror in its quality of lightest reflection, only image and not the body of the thing. Its form doesn't matter. No form manages to circumscribe and alter it. Mirror is light. A tiny piece of mirror is always the whole mirror. Remove its frame or the lines of its edges and it grows like spilling water. Like, who describes a mirror like that? Clarice is just able to, like, I think a lot, like, with a lot of existential writers, they are able to take the most mundane things that we come into contact with all the time, and attribute some spectacular quality to it, which I guess as somebody that finds a lot of meaning in aestheticism and sensualism and finding beauty in the mundane and finding something spectacular in absolutely nothing, I think that maybe that's why that resonates with me, is like attributing that spectacular, almost otherworldly quality to things that we would normally just not even consider at all. So I think that's maybe why I like Agua Viva so much, and it just seems like a happy book, and it's a book that I read and that brings me joy for life. I am not mad for talking about Clarice Lispector for like 10 minutes, because I absolutely adore her, and I think everybody is doing themselves a service if they read her. On that note, we're gonna plunge way back down into a completely different way of writing, an entirely different subject matter, and I gotta talk to you guys about a different book, a different author, and somebody that you guys might not like very much, but I think has place in my life, has had a place in my life, not anymore, but I think is worth reading for several reasons, and that is Charles Bukowski. And the book that I'm talking about is his book Women. That's the book that I read. And the reason why, I was introduced to Charles Bukowski through a poem of his called The Shoelace Poem. I know that Charles Bukowski's way of speaking, especially in this book, especially about women, I can understand why people can just find him absolutely disreputable, despicable, it's just awful. However, when I came upon Charles Bukowski, I felt like I found him at the right time. And I was a very, very sad, confused, angry person and looking for escapism wherever I could. I didn't understand myself. I didn't understand what I wanted. And Charles Bukowski kind of just came up into my life, and I felt like somebody was speaking plainly. It was interesting because Clarice and Charles Bukowski are so different, obviously, in the way that they write, but both of them brought me clarity at different points in my life. And the way that they wrote brought me clarity, which just kind of goes to show like how your brain changes and how your experiences change, your perception changes all the time. And at that time, I needed somebody as brutal, as simple, low, and so much of a low life as Charles Bukowski. I needed that person in my life. I needed that voice in my life. Women, I also listened on audiobook because there's an awesome narrator for it. I actually listened to it on YouTube. But this book is about a very relatively happy time in Charles Bukowski's life. This was when Charles Bukowski started to find some success in his writing after a long time of not finding success and living in the most horrific conditions you can imagine, drinking heavily every single day, and rarely coming across another human being that would alter anything in his life. But he wrote every goddamn day, and he wrote poems, and there was just some, like I said, there's not much to the writing. It's just plain speaking, and sometimes you just need to hear somebody talk about it. You need the bullshit cut out of things. As much as I, plead with people to romanticize and poeticize things, this was a time in my life where absolute lack of poetry and just saying things as they were, I found it amusing and I found it comforting. It was just a little life that he was living, and then at this time there was just an influx of women coming into his life, and I just found it amusing. I found it comedic. I found it it was just humorous to me. It made me think, life is not so bad. I don't have to take things so seriously. And that was the biggest takeaway, I think, from reading him. It's just a great deal of humor in the face of all tragedy, or even just the mundane. Humor in the face of that. I needed Charles Bukowski, I think, sometime in my life. I don't need him anymore, but I really found a place in my heart for him. If that's something that you're interested in, I suggest that book. Now, to dive into the heart of suffering, I'm going to talk about some other books that are quite sad and can be difficult to read. The lesser of the two that I'm going to talk about is going to be Tears and Saints by Emil Cioran. He was a Romanian philosopher and minor historian. This book is my introduction to him. He's well known for being very nihilistic, fatalistic. He's kind of an advocate for antinatalism, and one of his most famous books would be The Trouble with Being Born. Pretty bleak way of looking at the world. However, again, just like Charles Bukowski, it's kind of like he wrote, Emil was writing about topics usually that were quite sad, contemplating suicide and death all the time. And, what is the point of all of this? Anything that we do, anything that we have created is just a distraction from the lack of significance in life, that we create significance in order to distract ourselves. Apparently he was a very cheerful person, and there's a lot of wit in his writing. There's a lot of small aphorisms, and that's kind of what this entire book is. They're just these small little statements. I enjoy that there is despite him feeling like life really has no meaning and being kind of probably maybe one of the best faces for nihilism, he still did things. He still wrote, and he even said, I believe, that he If he wasn't writing, he'd probably kill himself. But this book in particular, I found it interesting because it's like a study. It's a study of pain, but specifically through sainthood and through religion. And I don't know about you, but I've always found the idea of martyrdom and sainthood very interesting. And he makes it with these statements in here because he wrote this after researching sainthood for many years. All of the statements in here just are wonderful musings about the idea of sainthood. And of course, there's his nihilism that comes in through there. And like people who have read Tioran, I'd say that the statements that are here, they may be overreaching and maybe they're a little bit too quick to the point, but I find them charming reading these, especially whenever he talks about like, for example, like the Rose of Lima and like her suffering and like why she was Rose of Lima was one of the most well-known saints when it came to her suffering, and she had a very special way of doing it. He wrote here, Rose of Lima, born in South America, is a model for all of those with a vocation for suffering. Young and beautiful, she would not think of an excuse to resist her mother's wish to bring her out in society. But she finally found a compromise. Under the crown of flowers on her head, she pinned a needle that pricked her head incessantly. Thus she satisfied her desire to be alone in society. One conquers the temptation of the world through pain. For whom did Rose of Lima put a needle in her crown? The heavenly lover made a new victim. Jesus was the Don Juan of agony. And then he goes to talk about like this is something that I found very interesting, was how he was saying that saintliness is a special kind of madness, and that saints oftentimes don't sleep very much, and that they put themselves into these states of agony in order to achieve a kind of mystical hysteria. And he says it here, saintliness is the negation of life through heavenly hysteria. How does one negate life? Through uninterrupted lucidity. Hence the saint's almost total suppression of sleep. Rose of Lima never slept more than 2 hours a night, and when she felt that sleep was overpowering her, she would hang herself on a cross in her room, or force herself to stand by tying her hair to a nail. Saintliness is a special kind of madness. While the madness of mortals exhausts itself in useless and fantastic actions, holy madness is a conscious effort towards winning everything. There's just so many statements like that. Like, that's all this book is comprised of, is statements like that. Sadness makes you God's prisoner. And towards the end of the book, the best way to describe why this suffering is so prominent in religion and sainthood, it says here, we are not when we are at one with the world. Our desire to escape the world and thus be ourselves sends us on a quest for suffering. Asceticism is the paroxysm of such desire, a systematic insomnia and starvation. Self-torture intensifies subjectivity. And then, of course, the book is named Tears and Saints. So tears are the flowering of this suffering, which he finds so mystifying and interesting. But I definitely got this book not because I am like super interested in his philosophies, but I was interested in his philosophies in regards to sainthood and this book. And it's a book you can't really dislike. You go through it and there are just these wonderful little poetic, they just seem poetic little phrases about suffering and why suffering is so seductive. And I love that because I've always found suffering seductive, and he makes a very good point about why it is, and this lucidity and this madness and this wakefulness, this state of pure, like, of conquering is all very interesting to me. So I would definitely suggest getting this. It's not a cheap book to buy for how small it is, but would definitely still suggest it. Now, at the height of our suffering, I'm going to talk to you guys about a book that you guys have probably never heard of, and that is going to be written by one of my favorite artists, musicians, and that is The Consumer by Michael Gira. Michael Gira, for the longest time, was the lead singer and producer and composer. He did everything. For Swans, the band Swans. He's also a great lover of literature and history and crime novels and mystery novels, if I'm correct. And I think he also just has a penchant for writing, just in general. But if you like the band Swans, then I highly suggest that you read The Consumer. I have found a digital copy online, and I've had it for a long time. This is coming from a man who is, or did at some point, look at the world through a very pessimistic view. Because The Consumer is interesting in the way that it's a bunch of short stories that outline pretty much every atrocity ever created by human beings, ever executed by human beings. And if you like horror, if you like grotesque things, then this is a collection of short stories for you. For the sake of not being too morbid or sad, I will not quote anything from this book because it's pretty horrific. A lot of the stories will make you sick, probably. A lot of the stories, because they're so real, a lot of them, so many of them just, it sounds like something you would hear on the news or a story you dig up from the dark web or something like that. Just, it's like touching something forbidden, just and laid out in the most brutal way possible. Michael Gira is an incredible writer. And there's, I guess, okay, I think I can say one. There's one story in the book where a character slices open their face with a razor blade and talks about the paroxysms of pain. That's been one of my favorite words. There's something about reading a book like The Consumer, or any kind of horror, especially horror that's meant to imitate something very real, like real things that happen all the time, real crimes that happen. There's something about reading The Consumer that doesn't surprise me so much. There's this quote, "For despair, I substitute awe." And that's how I feel when I read something like The Consumer. And I think about human nature, and I think about murder and all of the horrible things that we do all the time. And I look at it with awe. I think that's the best way to describe how I feel when I read The Consumer, when I read about atrocities that humans commit all the time. I stop being frightened by them, and I start thinking of it as almost to be expected. All perversions, I'd expect. Anything, mutilation, it makes sense to me. And The Consumer is a crowning jewel of that feeling. That this is the corner of the world where all of the awful things are, but they're represented in such a way that it seems normal. And that this is the ugly underbelly of the world that nobody wants to talk about, but is normal and does happen all the time. And it is part of our nature, and it is part, maybe it isn't natural, but all of the perversions and disorders and everything exist. And they're there, and they're part of what we call human. So I think that's what I like so much about it. Okay, so we're gonna go back to some of the more happy books, and we're gonna end on happy books. The next book that I want to talk to you guys all about is a book that's very dear to my heart. I have not finished it. It is long. It's meaty. It is a bitch, but it is one of my favorite books. It is The Age of Insight by Eric Kandel. And because you guys know I'm a turn of the century bitch, this book is going to be a study of the intersection between art and science at the turn of the century, specifically in Vienna. And it talks about neuroscience and art. It talks about biology, and it talks about all of the developments that have been going on in medicine and art and how it led up to this time period in Vienna. We're talking about a time where artists were intermingling in salons with biologists, with psychoanalysts, with all people of medicine and science. They are having conversations with one another. The Age of Insight is a book that's meant to demystify art to those who are scientific and vice versa, and that either or can help one another, and can also better our understanding of how we perceive art. And it does this through the portraiture of the main artists in Vienna, working in Vienna at the time. It is absolutely fascinating. It's talking about the top-down processing in our brains, and it talks about portraiture and how, you know, we react to somebody's face. It's even interesting, like, for example, Gustav Klimt, it says in The Age of Insight, that in the Adele Bloch-Bauer portrait that is so famous, The Golden Girl, all of the motifs and decoration that you see in that isn't just, it didn't just come out of nowhere, but they are meant to resemble male and female cells. He even talks about Sheila, for example, and talks about really, really cool, like how our emotions in our past are imbued in our work as artists. And this is when I came to the realization that any kind of art that you create, you're saying something about yourself, no matter what. It's a psychological thing as much as it is an emotional, you know, something that you just feel that you have to do or intuitive at the time. But Sheila, for example, his portraiture is indicative of his traumas and his fears of sexuality and his past, his mother, illness, and all that. It's all in the work, and you can see it in the line work and the hues that he uses. Like all of his sitters usually look like they're kind of flushed and like they have an infection is about to come upon them, and then the lines are shaky, and there's a lot of talk about distortion in portraiture. Our brain, for example, likes not necessarily symmetrical faces, but we like faces, like this is proven that our brains react more to faces that are exaggerated, where the features are asymmetrical and strange looking rather than symmetry. There's even really interesting, I think it was Kokoschka that he was talking about, that his portraits, the way that he did portraiture, it was eerie because they were able to predict certain things about a person before that person knew anything about them. Like he was famously, in this book, he was known to have predicted that somebody was going to have a stroke due to the way that he painted the person's portrait. It's just a cool book. How can you not love like learning about art, and also like why you like a certain thing, or like what are the processes in the brain that allow you to appreciate art, or why does a certain portrait attract you? I just think it's cool, and it's just another cool thing that happened at the turn of the century. And I love this book. If you're willing to read even like 100 pages of it, you definitely will not leave a lesser person. The last book that I'm going to talk about, which I've mentioned on this channel, I'm gonna say it right now, I didn't read this whole book. I read this book for one person and one person only. It is The Unfinished Palazzo by Judith Mackrell, and I read it because one of the women who lived at the Palazzo in Venice was the Marchesa Casati. And the Marchesa Casati is somebody that I talked about in my Muse video, in my Anatomy of a Muse video. Because the Marchesa was considered to be one of the last dandies to ever exist. But she is known for her extraordinary taste, her wardrobe, her fabulous parties that she threw at this residence in Venice. And she was committed to making her life a work of art. And while I do not think that you need money in order to do this, to make your life a work of art, she certainly had the bank account in order to fund various artists, to be a patron of the arts, to fund these elaborate parties where artists could meet other artists and meet people of prominence in the world, and to just spread this wealth, not only with money, but also to allow others to socialize and to come into contact with one another and to meet each other, and for the ideas to spread. I loved learning about the Marchesa's life, her love life with the political figure D'Annunzio, and I just wanted to, this book, The Unfinished Palazzo, is about this residence, specifically in the three different women that lived in it, which it is now what is known as the Guggenheim Museum in Venice. This book is about the three different women that lived in the Palazzo in Venice, which is going to be the Marchesa, Luisa Casati, who lived there first, who was the person of my interest, and then there was Doris Kasselross, and then we had Peggy Guggenheim was the last, and now it is the Guggenheim Museum. But I read this book specifically for Louisa because I wanted to know what her life was like. Some of the most well-known stories of Venice are of Louisa walking around naked in a fur coat with cheetahs at the end of a leash. I believe the police had to actually ask Louisa to go veiled in public because she drew such crowds in Venice. And it's just hearing about it and knowing what it must have been like, you know, the gondolas on the water and having people arrive at night on the gondolas to parties there, and just that beautiful twinkling world on a water that is Venice, especially at that time and then in the early 1900s. Again, just my time period, but it was a beautiful thing to read about this, her life there, and the people, the sparkling socialites and artists and people of all walks of life coming there, and the performances that were going on, and all of the theatrics that surrounded Louisa. I loved reading this book, and I'm sure the other two women also led very interesting lives, but I of course was most interested in the queen, my queen of my heart, Louisa. But I would definitely encourage anybody to read the whole book. I'm sure it's very interesting, especially with Miss Guggenheim and how she ended up probably turning it into a museum and everything that surrounded that. But what's interesting too is that every single woman completely remodeled the palazzo, and it's unfinished, but like they all remodeled it in their image, right? So their style and the interiors and the art that they decorated it with, and the people that were there. So, you know, it had multiple different lives. So it's a cool book. All right, those are the books that I've been keeping from you guys. Yeah, those are the books that I wanted to share with you guys today, regardless of the subject matter, regardless of the genre. You guys asked for it, so here are all those books for you. That's what I have for you guys today. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know what your suggestions are in the comments, of course. Let me know if you guys have read any of these books or what you think about any of them or the authors who wrote them. Please do not forget to like and subscribe as always, and I will see you guys next week. Bye-bye.